The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric prayer as Rachel Torres pushed through the staff entrance at Sacred Heart Hospital, her badge clipped to faded scrubs that hung loose on a frame built from 6 years of carrying other people's weight. 3 days. She'd been here 3 days, and already the hospital's rhythms had begun to overlay her own breathing like a second pulse, the ventilator wheeze from the ICU, the rhythmic beeping of monitors down the north corridor, the sound of rubber-soled shoes squeaking against linoleum that never quite stayed clean no matter how many times the evening shift mopped. She kept her head down during shift changes, moving through the corridors with the kind of practiced invisibility that came from learning, early, how to exist without being seen. The parking lot had been dark when she arrived at 5:13 a.m. 43 minutes before her shift began. She liked the quiet, the way the hospital looked like a sleeping animal before it woke up and started demanding things from the people who worked inside it. The air conditioning tasted like stale antiseptic and something underneath it that smelled like old metal and fear, and Rachel had learned not to flinch at these smells anymore, learned instead to treat them like information. Fear meant trauma. Old metal meant blood that had dried in places where water couldn't reach. These were just facts. These were just data points in a long string of data points that stretched back through places with names she wasn't supposed to remember anymore. She placed her worn combat boots in the bottom of her locker, the leather creased and darkened from desert dust that had never quite washed out, and covered them with the folded edges of her scrub pants and underwear. 3 sets, rotation. She wore the same size boot she'd worn in 2017 when the mission in Helmand Province had gone sideways in ways that still didn't have official names. The boots were the only physical object she owned that proved she'd been there at all. Photographs didn't exist. Records had been sealed. The Pentagon had taken her service record and locked it behind doors that required congressional authorization just to crack open, and it wasn't her place to wonder why. Orders were orders. Even the ones that told you to disappear. The ICU nurse station smelled like stale coffee and hand sanitizer, a combination that reminded Rachel of forward operating bases, though she never said this out loud. She'd stopped saying things out loud a long time ago. The morning shift supervisor, Marcus, 23 years at Sacred Heart, steady hands, the kind of person who noticed when patients' pain levels shifted by a single point on the 10-point scale, handed her the assignment sheet without looking up from his computer terminal. Post-op ward? Rachel asked, her voice coming out softer than it needed to be. She did this deliberately. She made herself smaller. She made her voice fit the shape of someone who wasn't expecting to be heard. Marcus glanced up. He was in his 50s, black, with grey threading through his beard, and he had the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been holding other people together for so long he'd forgotten how to set the work down. Dr. Sterling moved you, he said. ICU rotation. He wants you on the difficult cases. High-acuity patients. Rachel's hands didn't shake when she took the assignment sheet. They didn't shake when she read the names. They didn't shake when she understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water running through her veins, that this was intentional. Dr. Sterling had barely acknowledged her existence in the 3 days she'd been at Sacred Heart, had looked through her the way he looked through the cleaning staff, the phlebotomists, anyone whose salary didn't warrant his attention. But he'd noticed something. He'd noticed the way she moved. He'd noticed the way her eyes tracked exits and entry points when she was supposed to be reviewing charts. She'd let her guard down. Just for a moment. Just enough. Understood, Rachel said, and turned to walk toward the ICU with the assignment sheet held in her right hand. Her left hand was in her pocket, and she was aware of it there with the same tactical awareness she brought to everything else. Her left hand held 3 fingers that had healed imperfectly after a blast fragmentation incident in 2015. The scarring was visible if you knew what you were looking for. The way those fingers moved, slightly slower than their counterparts, with a measured deliberation, told a story to people who understood trauma. To people who'd treated trauma. To combat medics who'd spent time in places where IEDs were as common as dust. The ICU on the 2nd floor was a different animal than the post-op ward. 16 beds. Ventilators hissing their mechanical breath. The air here tasted like it had been filtered through copper. Rachel moved through the ward slowly, reading charts, assessing patients the way she'd been trained to assess them, not just their current vitals, but the trajectory. Where were they heading? What was their body trying to tell them? Pain was information. Vital sign patterns were information. The way a patient held their shoulders, the depth of their breath, whether their eyes were tracking movement or fixed in a 1,000-yard stare, all of it was information if you knew how to read it. By 7:15 a.m., she'd identified 3 patients who were trending toward crisis in the next 48 to 72 hours. Patient in bed for sepsis trajectory. Patient in bed 9, pulmonary edema, diuretics not optimized. Patient in bed 11, acute kidney injury, fluid balance precarious. She'd written these observations in the margin of her notes in handwriting so small that only someone looking very carefully would notice. She'd learned not to volunteer information. She'd learned that speaking up got noticed, and getting noticed was dangerous when your service record had been filed away in a classified tomb and your presence in civilian hospitals was supposed to be unremarkable. A combat medic named Jackson worked the day shift on the ICU, a younger man in his early 30s with the kind of muscled frame that came from gym discipline rather than field conditioning. He was reviewing the mechanical ventilator settings on bed 2 when Rachel passed, and something in her movement, the way she assessed the numbers on the monitor without breaking stride, the precise angle of her head as she read the readout, made him turn and watch her. "You used to do this," he said. Not a question. Rachel didn't stop walking. "I'm a nurse," she replied, which was technically true. She'd gone back to school after the Pentagon had dissolved her life. She'd gotten her RN license under her own name, because they'd let her keep that much. She'd kept the name Rachel Torres and the general fact of her existence, but everything else had been filed away in classified archives and locked rooms and the kind of institutional memory that required top-secret clearance just to access. Jackson followed her to bed 3, where an elderly man with COPD was breathing shallow, his oxygen saturation dancing at the edge of acceptable ranges. "My unit trained with Navy trauma surgeons," Jackson said quietly. "SEALs, mostly. Corpsmen who'd done field medicine in Helmand. The way you just assessed that vent, the angle of your approach, the economy of movement, I've only seen that from guys who'd done real work." Rachel stood very still for a moment. Then she turned to face him, and her eyes met his, and she allowed them to be flat. Empty of anything that might be recognized as a story. "I've had nursing jobs before," she said. "Different settings. You pick things up." She turned back to the patient and began checking the 4-line, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, from 6 years of keeping people alive in places where mistakes meant funerals that would never happen because the people you were burying had officially never existed. Her fingers, even the 3 that healed wrong, moved with practiced certainty. She didn't tremor. She didn't hesitate. She simply worked. Jackson watched her for another few seconds, and then something in his face shifted. Understanding flickered behind his eyes like a light coming on in a distant room. Rachel felt it happen and felt the weight of it. She'd been seen. Not identified, not yet, but noticed in a way that meant this job, like all the others, had an expiration date printed on it in invisible ink. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the moment Marcus came to find her at 9:36 a.m. to tell her that her VA medical records, the one she'd submitted as part of her hospital credential verification, had been flagged in the system. "They're sealed," Marcus said, frowning at his tablet. "Congressional authorization required. I've never seen that in a civilian employee file." "You military." "General service history," Rachel said, which was the official story. Nothing classified. But her VA records were sealed because her entire 6-year service record was classified. Everything from 2012 to 2018 had been stamped with markings that required federal authorization to even look at. The Pentagon had done that on purpose. They'd taken her life and locked it behind doors that only specific people could open, and they'd never explained why. They'd just told her to disappear, and disappear she had, until 3 days ago when she'd needed a job and this hospital had needed temporary nursing staff and the gaps in her employment history had seemed simple enough to explain. Rachel acknowledged Marcus's statement with a slight nod and continued checking the monitors. But her mind was already working through the exit routes. The parking garage had 3 stairwells. The main entrance was monitored but not locked. She could be in her car in less than 4 minutes if she moved quickly. She could be out of Portland by nightfall. She'd done this before. She'd gotten good at leaving. But Dr. Sterling had other plans. He arrived at the ICU nurse station at 10:27 a.m., his white coat pristine, his watch catching the fluorescent lights in a way that had clearly been practiced in a mirror somewhere. Rachel was updating a patient's medication administration record, and she felt him before she heard him, felt the weight of his attention like a change in air pressure. He stood in the doorway to the station, watching her work. Watching the way her hands moved. Watching the way she assessed each step of the process without consulting references or hesitation. "Ms. Torres," he said, and his voice had the texture of someone used to being obeyed. "A word." Rachel set down the electronic tablet and stood, and her posture was all submission, all deference, all the smaller version of herself that she'd constructed so carefully. "Of course, doctor." He led her to his office, corner view, mahogany desk, framed certificates from hospitals in San Francisco and Seattle on the walls. A man who'd been important once, in other places. A man who'd built a career on being noticed and respected and feared. "I'm wondering," he said, settling into his leather chair with a kind of ease that spoke of old money, of inherited confidence, "what a woman with your particular set of skills is doing working temporary shifts in Portland." Rachel stood in front of his desk, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes meeting his without challenge. "I prefer temporary work, doctor. More flexibility." He smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "Your VA file is sealed." "Completely sealed. Do you know how rare that is?" He leaned back in his chair. "I made some calls. No one will tell me what you did. No one will even confirm which branch you served in." Rachel's heart rate didn't accelerate. Her hands didn't tremble. She was trained for this. She was trained for the moment when someone realized that the person in front of them was not quite what they appeared to be. But she was also trained to survive, and surviving sometimes meant finding another job in another town and disappearing again. "I had a medical discharge," she said, which was close enough to the truth that it might pass. "There was paperwork. I'm sure it's in the system." "The paperwork says you were in naval medicine," Sterling said, reading from his computer screen. "Specialty listed as her classified field operations. Do you know how unusual that is? How many people have that in their personnel file?" Rachel said nothing. She'd learned that silence was often more powerful than any explanation could be. Sterling stood and came around the desk, and he was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and carefully calibrated to convey success. He was studying her forearms, where the edge of a scar was visible just above the wrist of her scrub sleeve. The scar from blast fragmentation in 2015. The scar that told a story to people who knew how to read it. "Whatever you were," he said, "you're not that anymore. You're a temp nurse in Portland, Oregon, and you work for me. And I'm beginning to think you might be a problem." He walked back to his desk and dismissing her with a gesture. Rachel turned and left the office, and as she passed through the doorway, she understood with perfect clarity what was happening. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't overthinking. This was recognition, and it was the beginning of something that would end with her disappearing again. But first, there were patients who needed her. The staff lounge at Sacred Heart Hospital smelled like burnt coffee and regret. Dr. Sterling stood by the window, leather wallet already open, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I'll give it a week before our little temp quits," he announced to the cluster of residents gathered around the break table. $50 emerged from his billfold, crisp and deliberate. "Anyone want to take that action?" "Friday. She'll be gone by Friday." 3 residents laughed. One, a surgery resident named Kowalski with the kind of arrogance that only comes from 4 generations of family money, actually took the bet. Their hands touched over the bill. A handshake that sealed it. Rachel stood at the coffee station, her back to all of them, pouring her cup with movements so controlled they seemed to require translating commands from somewhere deep in her spine. She'd heard. The room wasn't large enough not to hear. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical drone, and beneath that sound, she could feel Sterling's eyes on her back like a physical thing. Testing. Measuring. Waiting to see if she'd crack. She turned. Met his gaze. Took one measured breath, and when she spoke, her voice came out like still water, flat, clear, impossible to read. I've survived worse odds from better men. The room went dead silent. Sterling's smile didn't waver, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Kowalski set down his coffee. One of the nurses busied herself with the sugar dispenser. The moment stretched like taffy, and then Sterling laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that didn't reach his eyes, and turned back to his newspaper as if she'd already stopped existing. But he was thinking. Rachel could see it in the way his fingers moved across the page without actually reading anything. She'd just done something unforgivable. She'd refused to break. She'd answered his cruelty with something that sounded an awful lot like experience, and now Dr. Sterling, who prided himself on knowing exactly how to manipulate every person in his orbit, had encountered someone who didn't react the way people were supposed to react. That was going to be a problem. 2 days later, the cafeteria. Rachel stood in line with her lunch tray, patient charts balanced carefully beside her protein and vegetables, when Dr. Sterling emerged from the service corridor at exactly the right moment, or the wrong moment, depending on your perspective. He didn't bump her shoulder. He didn't accidentally or trip her. He reached past her for a napkin, and in that same movement, his hip connected with the corner of her tray with the precision of someone who'd calculated the exact angle in advance. The tray went horizontal. Patient charts scattered across the linoleum like autumn leaves. Tomato soup splashed across her scrubs, bright red against white cotton. The entire floor watched. 40 people. Maybe more. Pick that up, sweetheart, Sterling said, his voice loud enough to carry across the cafeteria, loud enough to ensure maximum audience. Temps need to learn to be more careful. He didn't apologize. He didn't crouch down to help. He just stood there with his empty tray, watching, waiting to see her scramble. Rachel knelt. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. She collected each chart, wiped tomato soup from the floor with napkins, pressed the damp paper against the tile until the spill was gone. Every gesture spoke a language made of precise control. She stood, brushed soup residue from her scrubs, and met his eyes with the same flat composure she'd used before. I've had harder orders from better men. His smile tightened. 2 residents near the espresso machine exchanged glances. One whispered something to the other. Sterling turned and walked away without responding, but his shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there before. She'd done it again. She'd refused to perform the correct emotion. She'd answered his cruelty the same way she'd answered his mockery, as if she'd heard worse from people whose authority had actually meant something. The next morning, rounds. Dr. Sterling held up one of Rachel's charts in front of the nursing staff and 2 visiting medical students, his voice pitched for maximum public audience. This is what happens when hospitals hire undertrained temps. Look at this. He pointed to her documentation with something like theatrical disgust. Vitals every 15 minutes on a stable patient. What are you trying to prove, Nightingale? That you care more than everyone else. The med student shifted uncomfortably. One of the residents studied her shoes. Rachel stood with her hands folded. Her face remained perfectly composed. And then, without warning or permission, a single tear escaped down her left cheek. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply wiped it with her thumb, maintained eye contact, waited 3 full seconds, and spoke in a voice that cut through the tension like surgical steel. That patient had subtle tachycardia trending upward at 24-minute intervals. His heart rate climbed from 88 to 112 during my shift. He coded 20 minutes after I flagged it for cardiology. Would you like to review the emergency response logs, doctor, or should I just pull the security footage? A charge nurse named Patterson covered her mouth. One of the med students' eyes went wide. Sterling's jaw clenched so hard his temple pulsed, and he walked away without responding, the only appropriate response, since she'd just documented his incompetence in front of witnesses and made it impossible for him to reframe as anything other than what it was, negligence that her vigilance had prevented from becoming a body count. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Rachel was restocking supplies in the supply room when two nurses passed in the hallway outside, their voices carrying through the open door. "Did you see Sterling's billing codes from last week?" one of them whispered. The other responded with something that made Rachel's hands stop moving. 3 procedures on that end-stage dementia patient in 412. 3. And the family says he was unresponsive, barely alert. How does Sterling manage an emergency decompression on someone who can't cooperate? Rachel stood in the supply room in the dim fluorescent light, boxes of gauze and saline in her hands, and understood exactly what Dr. Sterling had been protecting. The phantom procedures. The patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. The families who trusted the hospital. The billing codes that kept his lake house funded and his retirement growing at a rate that no standard medical salary should allow. He'd built an empire on the people nobody was watching closely enough. And she'd just made herself into the watcher he couldn't afford. She could feel him recalibrating. That evening, Dr. Sterling began documenting everything. Every interaction. Every moment Rachel worked beyond her shift. Every time she flagged a patient concern. He had her charts copied and filed in a folder that he carried with him like a weapon being forged. His phone calls increased, to board members, to HR, to people she didn't have names for yet. His strategy shifted from public humiliation to something far more dangerous, the systematic construction of a case file. By Thursday evening, Rachel knew what was coming. She could see it in the way the charge nurse avoided her eyes. She could hear it in the whispers that stopped when she entered a room. Sterling was building something, and when it was finished, he was going to use it to make her disappear. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Rachel Torres had been disappearing her entire life. She'd already erased herself once. She knew how to do it so thoroughly that even Pentagon records had a gap shaped exactly like her absence. She'd trained for 12 years as a senior chief petty officer running trauma operations in Helmand Province, and she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was simply show up and be competent in front of the wrong people. The mute Special Forces general was scheduled to arrive at Sacred Heart the following Tuesday, his chart marked with redactions and classified stamps, his presence authorized by people whose authority transcended the normal hospital hierarchy. Sterling didn't know about him yet. But he would. And when he did, everything was going to change. The question was whether Rachel would still be there to see it. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor of Sacred Heart Hospital, and no one watching the pale, thin man in the wheelchair being pushed by a VA aide understood what they were looking at. His chart was stamped in 3 places with classified markings. His name appeared in redacted form. The admission note simply read, "Transfer from Walter Reed. Post-operative monitoring. No civilian visitors. No media contact." A Special Forces general who had taken shrapnel in Kandahar province 6 months ago and hadn't spoken a word since, not to his surgeons, not to his daughter, not to himself in the privacy of his hospital room at night. The hospital staff treated him like any other patient. They didn't know. They had no idea they were moving a legend through their corridors. Rachel was restocking the supply cart on 4 North when she heard the commotion, the extra security detail, the whispered conversation between the ward clerk and the charge nurse about classified admissions and locked medical records. She kept her hands moving, selecting gauze packs and 4 lines with the same methodical precision she'd used 6 years ago in Helmand Province, preparing for casualties that came in on stretchers with wounds that didn't match any textbook diagram. Her body remembered the rhythm. Don't ask questions. Don't look up. Keep working. But when they wheeled him past her station, something shifted in the air itself. The general's eyes, grey and sharp as winter ocean, caught hers for exactly 1 second. Rachel's hand stilled. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Then the aide wheeled him around the corner, and the moment dissolved like smoke. The call came at 2:43 p.m. A voice on the overhead pager clipped an urgent trauma team to room for 12. Stat! Rachel didn't hesitate. She'd been a temp for 5 days now, 5 days of watching Dr. Sterling's jaw tighten every time she anticipated an order before it was given, every time her hands moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 battlefield saves. The elevators were slower than the stairs. She took the stairs. Room for 12 was chaos compressed into 800 square feet. The general sat upright in his bed, his fingers clawing at his throat, his oxygen saturation dropping like a stone falling through dark water. The monitor showed it clearly, 94. 89, 82. His chest was barely moving. His trachea was visibly shifted to the right, a tension pneumothorax, the lung collapsing against itself, crushing the heart. Textbook presentation. Fatal if untreated in the next 90 seconds. No attending was in the room. No resident. No physician at all. Martinez, the combat medic who'd been assisting with post-op care, was already moving toward the crash cart when Rachel stepped through the door. He glanced back, saw her, hesitated, the split-second calculation of who has authority here, who can give orders. Rachel didn't wait for him to decide. She moved to the bedside like she was being pulled by gravity itself, her hands already reaching for the alcohol pad and the 14-gauge needle from the emergency kit she'd snatched from the wall. The general's eyes locked on hers. No fear. Understanding. The look of a man who recognized what was about to happen because he'd seen it before, in conditions far worse than this hospital room with its humming machines and sterile tile. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, Rachel said quietly, and her voice had changed, dropped an octave, shed the careful deference of the temp nurse like a snake shedding old skin. She swabbed the site with alcohol, the sharp antiseptic smell cutting through the recycled air, through her own racing pulse. Her fingers found the landmarks, the second rib, the space above it where the needle needed to go. Muscle memory. 6 years of this. 1,000 times intense with sand blowing through bullet holes in the canvas, with young men screaming and dying if her hands didn't work fast enough. 02 Sat, 78. She pushed the needle in without waiting for permission, without waiting for an attending to stand behind her and co-sign the decision. The needle slid through skin, through fascia, through pleural membrane with a resistance she could feel in her fingertips like reading Braille. And then the hiss. The unmistakable sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a pneumothorax decompressing, of a lung re-expanding, of death stepping back from the precipice. The general's body went rigid for 1 breath, 2 breaths. Then his shoulders sagged. The monitor climbed, 82. 87, 91. 95, his oxygen saturation rising like an elevator. His color returned in seconds. The panic in his eyes softened into something else, gratitude, recognition, the knowledge of being pulled back from the edge by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Rachel withdrew the needle and held it steady, watching the stats climb another point. 96, her hands were steady. Surgical precision. Apex predator calm. But something was happening in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 6 years of invisibility, 6 years of being dead according to every official record, every Pentagon file. The general was staring at her like he was trying to memorize her face, like he was trying to burn the recognition into his memory before someone made her disappear again. A single tear left her eye. Not the tear of a frightened nurse. The tear of a soldier honoring another soldier across a distance that couldn't be named or acknowledged or spoken aloud. She didn't wipe it away. She kept the needle steady and watched the general's vitals normalize, watched his breathing deepen, watched the color return to his face like someone returning from the dead. Jesus Christ, Martinez whispered from somewhere behind her shoulder. His voice was shaking. Jesus Christ, he moved closer, looking at the needle site, at the improved numbers on the monitor, at Rachel's face. That 3-point incision technique. The approach angle. I've only seen one person do it that fast. Rachel said nothing. She was already moving toward the sharps container, her expression controlled, her professional mask sliding back into place like a visor coming down. The combat medic had seen something. A technique. A precision. The kind of skill that didn't come from textbooks or standard nursing protocols but from years of working in conditions where hesitation meant someone died. But he hadn't identified her. He didn't know who had just saved the general's life. Nobody knew. Except the general. He was reaching for the whiteboard beside his bed, his hand trembling slightly as he grabbed the marker. Rachel watched without looking like she was watching. The marker moved across the whiteboard in large, unsteady letters. She saved my life. The general underlined it twice. Martinez read it and nodded, already reaching for his radio to call the attending, already preparing the explanation. Unauthorized but life-saving procedure, patient stability confirmed, vitals responding positively. The protocol violation was so obvious it was almost transparent. But the procedure itself was flawless. The decision-making was perfect. No physician would fault the outcome, even if they had to address the boundary crossing. Rachel was already stepping toward the door when she heard the footsteps in the hallway, the rapid approach of someone moving with purpose. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway within minutes, his phone already in his hand. He looked at the general first, the improved vitals, the color in his face, the oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%. Then his eyes moved to the needle decompression site. Then to Rachel. "Did you perform a procedure without physician authorization?" His voice was calm. Curious. A fisherman casting a line into dark water. Rachel met his eyes. Her hands were no longer shaking. "The patient would have died in the time it took to find you." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a tone that suggested she'd make the same decision again, that the outcome was more important than the protocol, that some things mattered more than the organizational hierarchy that paid their salaries. Sterling's jaw tightened. He stepped into the hallway, and Rachel watched through the window as he made his first call, his voice low but animated, his free hand gesturing as he described what had happened, what he'd witnessed. The general, unable to speak, grabbed the whiteboard again and wrote 3 more words, "She is one." Martinez turned to him. "One what, sir?" The general pointed at Rachel, then drew his hand across his neck in a line, indicating the incision, the site, the mark of someone trained to keep people alive in impossible conditions. The gesture meant something in the language of special forces, in the shorthand of men who'd bled together in the same sand, who'd watched each other carry wounds that never fully healed. Martinez understood. His face went pale. Sterling was making his second call now. Rachel watched his lips move, watched him point back toward the room while talking to someone on the line. A board member. Someone who owed him favors. Someone who needed to know that the temp nurse had violated protocol, had overstepped her authority, had acted without permission. 3 minutes later, a fourth call. Different tone. This one to someone in HR, someone Sterling had been building a relationship with, someone who could be useful in facilitating a termination. The words were too quiet to hear through the window, but Rachel didn't need to hear them. She'd seen this dance before. The setup. The documentation. The careful construction of a case. By end of shift, it was over. The administrator's office sent a message to the nurse's station. Rachel Torres was to report to administration at 5 p.m. sharp. The chief of staff wanted to see her. Martinez tried to intercede, moving toward the admin office before Rachel could stop him, his voice rising as he explained what she'd done, why she'd done it, that the patient would be dead without her intervention. "This is a serious violation of protocol," the administrator said, cutting him off mid-sentence. The tone was sympathetic but final. The decision was already made. The machinery was already in motion. Rachel collected her things from her locker. Her hands were steady as she reached for her pair of worn combat boots, the ones with salt stains from helm and rain, the ones with sand still embedded in the stitching even after 6 years. She held them for a moment, these witnesses to her other life, these reminders of who she'd been before the op went sideways, before 3 senators decided it had never happened, before she'd been ordered to die and became a ghost instead. The general was watching from his window when she walked past room for 12 one final time. His eyes met hers. He raised his hand, not a wave. A salute. Slow and deliberate. The hand of a soldier acknowledging another soldier. Rachel didn't salute back. She couldn't. But she nodded once, the barest inclination of her head, an acknowledgement that bridged the gap between who she'd been and who she was pretending to be, between the medic who'd trained in Helmand and the temp nurse being escorted out of Sacred Heart Hospital with her career in a cardboard box. The doors opened to the Portland rain. The elevator descended in silence except for the security guard's radio static crackling at his hip. Rachel stood motionless, the cardboard box balanced against her chest like a shield, her eyes fixed on nothing. 3 days. 96 hours from temp intake to escorted exit. The fluorescent light panels above flickered their mechanical rhythm as they dropped floor by floor, 7th, 6th, 5th, and she didn't move, didn't adjust her grip, didn't acknowledge the guard's uncomfortable glance in her direction. The lobby doors opened to Portland rain hammering the glass like small caliber rounds against a cargo container. She'd heard that sound before. She knew the acoustic difference between rain and gunfire, between thunder and incoming mortars, between the everyday violence of weather and the orchestrated violence of Helmand Province. This was only rain. Just water. Nothing to prepare for. Security handed her the termination letter at the main entrance, his voice apologetic in a way that made it worse. Immediate dismissal for unauthorized medical procedures and falsification of credentials. The last line made her jaw tighten, a visible micro-expression she couldn't suppress. She'd never lied. She'd omitted everything, under direct order from a Pentagon lawyer who'd explained that her records were sealed under national security protocols, that speaking about her service constituted violation of classification orders, that surfacing would mean court-martial. They'd been precise about it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres was officially dead. The records proved it. The paperwork was perfect. She opened the box in the parking lot, rain soaking through the cardboard, and looked at the boots. Combat-worn. Salt-stained from helm and sweat. The sole still held desert sand in the treads from a phi base outside Sanjin, grit that hadn't fully washed away in 3 years. These were the only physical objects that proved she'd existed as something other than a temp nurse. No medals. No photographs. No unit patch. Just boots. She'd kept them in her locker for 6 years because they were the last thing she'd held in her hands before they told her she was dead. That night she sat in the VA hospital waiting room not as a provider but as a patient. Insomnia, she told the intake nurse. Hasn't slept more than 3 hours since Helmand. The waiting room was crowded with veterans whose wounds she recognized with the precision of muscle memory. The Iraq Marine in the corner with the 1,000-yard stare, she'd seen that same 1,000-yard stare in the eyes of her corpsmen after they treated 30 casualties in 14 hours. The Afghanistan Army specialist missing both legs below the knee, she'd performed bilateral amputations in a forward surgical tent using an electric surgical saw and a hand drill because the power had failed. The Navy corpsman with a tremor in his hands, TBI written across his face like a brand, she'd treated identical traumatic brain injuries in the helm and sand. These were her patients. These were her responsibility. And she couldn't claim her service, couldn't explain where she'd learned to recognize their wounds, couldn't help them as the combat medic she'd actually been because her service officially never existed. The weight of her exile finally broke something inside her chest. She put her face in her hands for 2 hours, the combat boot sitting beside her on a cracked plastic chair, and a Vietnam vet, 70 if he was a day, purple heart visible on his jacket, reached over and squeezed her shoulder without asking questions. She left without being seen by a doctor. There was no diagnosis for service-related trauma when the service didn't exist. 24 hours later she returned to Sacred Heart not as an employee but as a ghost collecting a final paycheck. The ER was unusually crowded that Saturday afternoon, 3 traumas stacked in the bays, a pediatric asthma attack, an elderly fall with possible spinal involvement. She was waiting at the HR window when the ambulance doors burst open and a man was wheeled in on a gurney, shrapnel wounds across his left shoulder and chest, sedated but conscious. A former Taliban fighter, she heard someone say. Granted asylum through State Department programs. The man's eyes were unfocused initially, scanning the ceiling, the lights, the hands moving over his wounds. Then he turned his head and saw Rachel across the waiting room, and his body went rigid against the restraints. He started shouting in Pashto. The sound was raw, fractured, filled with something between rage and terror and disbelief. The nurses trying to move him to the trauma bay stepped back instinctively. An interpreter appeared within seconds, a young Afghan woman with a panic expression. Her voice shook as she translated, "He's calling her the American Devil Woman. He's saying she saved his brother in the Sanjin fight. He says his brother was pinned under a collapsed compound wall and she came under fire to pull him out. He says she's a legend. The fighters talk about her. They have a name for her." The interpreter's voice dropped to a whisper. "He says she's the reason his brother is still alive." The ER froze. Every monitor kept beeping, every pump kept clicking, but human motion stopped. Rachel's face drained to the color of old bone. She'd been 17 different people in 17 different moments since Helmand, but she'd never been a legend. She'd been a senior chief petty officer performing the job she was trained to perform. Now she was discovered by the enemy she'd fought against, in a hospital parking lot in Portland, 3 years after the government told her she'd officially died. The general's 12-year-old daughter emerged from the crowd near the physical therapy wing. She was small for her age, dark-haired, and her voice when she spoke was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 3 words. The title hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself, like she was naming something back into existence. A nurse behind the admissions desk, Sharon, older, career Navy, someone Rachel had seen on the hospital roster but never spoken to, was staring at her computer screen. Her hands were trembling. Her voice came out broken at the edges. Rachel Marie Torres. Service number 08579-642. 2 bronze stars with Vela devices. Purple Heart. Navy Cross. Sharon's voice caught on the last medal. Her eyes were wet. The Navy Cross. The crowd was growing. Phones appeared. People murmuring into devices. Rachel's composure was intact, but her breathing had changed, slightly deeper, slightly slower, the controlled respiration of someone managing their cardiovascular response under extreme stress. She'd trained for this moment. Just not in this location. A SEAL team leader in a Navy hoodie emerged from the surgical ward. Mid-40s, thick shoulders, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He recognized Rachel's name and stepped into the center of the crowd, his voice cutting through the background noise like a blade through silence. "Navy Cross," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. For carrying for wounded Marines through 300 meters of active enemy fire after their convoy was ambushed in Helmand Province, 2017. Continued treatment of casualties while receiving direct fire. Refused medevac until all wounded were stabilized and secure. He paused. The moment stretched. Silver Star for tactical medical response under extreme duress. Bronze Star for. Dr. Sterling pushed through the crowd, his face red, his voice loud and desperate. "This is absurd. She's a temp nurse who falsified credentials and violated protocol. I have documentation." "I have?" The SEAL turned to him with the kind of slow precision that indicated profound danger. "You need to stop talking, sir. You need to stop right now." The FBI agent materialized from the administrative wing like he'd been waiting in the walls. Dark suit. Badge visible. His voice was quiet, but it carried authority that made Sterling step backward. The classified operation was declassified this morning following congressional investigation. The senator responsible for the cover-up is under federal indictment for obstruction of justice. Senior Chief Torres was operating under legal orders when her records were sealed. Everything she did in Helmand was lawful, documented, and classified at the highest level. She violated no credentials. She broke no law. The crowd parted like water, and the general appeared. Martinez was wheeling him, the general's body still wrapped in post-surgical dressings, his jaw still swollen, but his eyes were focused and aware. He looked at Rachel with the kind of intensity that transcended speech, and slowly, painfully, he lowered himself from the wheelchair to kneel on the hospital floor. His movements were careful, controlled by extreme effort, and then he reached out and placed his hand over the worn combat boots Rachel still clutched in the cardboard box. Her composure finally cracked. She knelt with him, one hand on his shoulder, and for a moment she was no longer a temp nurse or a dead soldier or a ghost haunting hospital corridors. She was simply a medic who'd saved a patient, and the patient was kneeling before her to say thank you. The SEAL positioned himself between Rachel and Sterling without saying another word. Security approached Sterling with the kind of purposeful movement that indicated immediate employment termination. As they walked him toward the exit, Sterling tried to speak once more, tried to salvage something from the wreckage of his network and his favors and his phantom billing schemes, but the SEAL simply shook his head. The gesture meant everything. It meant Sterling's calls wouldn't be answered anymore. It meant his board members would return his calls with apologies. It meant his lake house was about to become significantly smaller. Rachel was still kneeling beside the general when the crowd started to disperse, when Martinez began to cry, when Sharon from admissions emerged from her desk and saluted with the kind of precision that only career military personnel understood. That night, Rachel sat in the VA hospital waiting room and watched the walls close in. 3 a.m. Fluorescent lights cast everything in corpse light, and the chairs, mismatched, worn through to the fabric, held men and women whose damage she recognized the way a sailor recognizes a rip current. The older man across from her had shrapnel scars mapping his left forearm in the exact pattern she'd treated in Helmand, 3rd Surgical Hospital, summer 2016. The woman by the window favored her right leg with the specific limp that came from an IED that detonated 2 meters from the target instead of 1. Pain was information. Always had been. She could read trauma the way other people read books. She was here for insomnia. The VA intake coordinator had made a note: patient reports difficulty sleeping, recurring hypervigilance, nightmares featuring combat scenarios. Rachel hadn't corrected her. Nightmares weren't the problem. The problem was the quiet. When everything went dark and the building stopped humming and the city outside stopped moving, her brain had nothing to do but replay the parts she'd buried. The 3 senators who decided an entire operation never happened. The order to disappear. The way the Pentagon had erased her the moment the op in Sanjin went sideways and 4 men didn't come home. Now it was over. Now she was dead officially, and dead again unofficially, and nobody seemed to understand that dead people don't get to just stand back up and walk around like they're alive. A veteran 3 chairs down was staring at her. She felt it before she looked, that weight of recognition. She didn't meet his eyes. She never did. Not in public. Not here. She was still thinking about how to disappear into the parking lot when the waiting room door opened and Rachel heard a name that stopped her breathing: Rachel Torres. Not her waiting room name. Not the temp designation. Her name. Her actual name. Spoken aloud by a nurse holding a discharge summary. She stood without thinking. The veteran across from her nodded once, slowly, and Rachel understood. He knew. He'd always known. 24 hours later, Sacred Heart's ER doors burst open to a different kind of chaos. A former Taliban fighter, maybe 50 years old, shrapnel embedded in his left shoulder and neck, was being wheeled into Trauma Bay 3. His blood smelled like copper and diesel. His eyes were wild. And then he saw her. Rachel was standing at the registration desk, holding the termination paperwork she'd come to collect, her final check, $37.16 for 3 days' work, plus the cardboard box someone had left at the security desk containing only her pair of worn combat boots. The boots she'd kept for 6 years as the only physical proof of who she'd been. The man's voice came out like a scream. Pashto. Dari. English fragments tangled together. Angel. The American Devil Woman. Sanjin. My brother Mustafa. You carried him. You carried him when the helicopters wouldn't come. The ER froze. Nurses stopped. Doctors halted mid-stride. The kind of silence that happens when everyone simultaneously realizes something has shifted in the room's geometry. Rachel didn't move. She didn't flinch. She set the cardboard box on the desk and walked toward the trauma bay with the same measured pace she'd used for 3 days as a temp nurse. Nobody noticed. The Afghan man was reaching for her, shouting names she hadn't heard in 8 years, and Rachel took his hand, the uninjured one, and said quietly, "I'm here. You're safe now. Let's get you fixed." That was when the general's daughter walked into the ER. She was 12, small for her age, with dark eyes that held the particular steadiness of military children. Her father, the mute general still recovering in ICU, had apparently called the school and arranged for an early pickup. The girl had come straight to Sacred Heart. She was holding a folder. When she saw Rachel emerging from the trauma bay, she walked directly to her and said in a voice like still water, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres." Not a question. A statement of rank. The clipboard fell from the nurse's hands. The sound it made hitting the floor was loud enough to draw every eye in the ER. Suddenly there was movement again, but it was different now, purposeful, urgent, the kind of coordinated action that happens when an institutional narrative suddenly rewrites itself. Sharon, the Navy veteran working admissions, appeared from her desk with something Rachel had never seen before, a thick file with a red declassified stamp across the front. Sharon's hands were shaking as she opened it. Her voice broke on the first line, 2 Bronze Stars for Valor in direct combat. Purple Heart, service-related wound, Kandahar Province, 2015. Each medal earned its own sentence. Each sentence earned its own pause. Silver Star, leadership under fire, Sanjan Valley operation. Navy Cross. Sharon's voice dropped to a whisper, for carrying for wounded personnel across active kill zones during a convoy ambush, returning to enemy fire 3 times to retrieve survivors when other units had fallen back. Medical equipment improvised in the field. All for personnel survived because you refused to leave them. The ER had become a cathedral. No movement. No sound except the monitors in the ICU 2 floors up, still tracking the general's steady recovery. A man in a dark suit with the particular bearing of federal authority stepped forward. He introduced himself as Special Agent Rodriguez, FBI. His voice carried the weight of institutional machinery finally catching up to individual truth. The Helmand Province operation, classified under National Security Directive 7A, was officially declassified at 1,100 hours this morning following a congressional investigation. He paused. Senator James Whitmore, who ordered the operation's erasure and testimony suppression, is currently under federal indictment for conspiracy and obstruction. Your service record has been fully restored. Your rank reinstated. Your pension retroactive to the date of your disappearance. Words arrived like shrapnel. Restored. Reinstated. Retroactive. The vocabulary of resurrection. Then the elevator opened on the far side of the ER, and the mute general came through in a wheelchair, pushed by an orderly. His face was thin, scarred from the shrapnel that had taken his voice 8 months ago. His left arm was still weak. But his eyes were clear, and they locked on Rachel with the intensity of someone looking at the person who'd pulled them back from whatever cliff they'd been falling toward. The general elevated himself from the wheelchair with the kind of careful determination that comes from months of rehabilitation. He lowered himself to one knee, then the other, until he was kneeling in front of Rachel Torres in the middle of Sacred Heart's ER at 1,430 hours on a Saturday afternoon. He placed his hand over the worn combat boots she was still clutching in the cardboard box. And he held it there. No words. No need for words. The message was written in the position of his body, the steadiness of his hands, the tears on his face. You saved me. You saved me when you had nothing. You saved me when you were invisible. Rachel's jaw tightened. That was all. That was the only thing her face permitted, one small muscular contraction that meant she was holding everything together by pure discipline. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady as surgical steel. It's an honor, sir. The security guard who had walked Rachel out Friday afternoon with her cardboard box, the same guard who'd watched Dr. Sterling's expression when he learned his phantom billing scheme had been discovered, appeared at Dr. Sterling's office door at 1600 hours Monday. Sterling was already packing, his hands moving with mechanical precision through the rituals of departure, diplomas from Georgetown, magazine profiles praising his innovative billing models, framed certificates of appreciation from board members who would now actively cooperate with federal investigators to save their own careers. The guard set an identical cardboard box on Sterling's desk. He met Sterling's eyes, and his voice carried the weight of institutional judgment. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Sterling's hand shook as he finished packing. When he walked to the elevator, nurses watched from the hallway. None of them spoke. None of them had to. The silence was more complete than any words could have been, the silence of professional respect withdrawn, of institutional trust evaporated, of a man becoming a memory the moment the elevator doors closed. His keycard was deactivated before he reached his car. 6 months later, in the basement classrooms of Portland Community College, Sterling stood in front of a class of bored high school students and demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Annie. His hourly rate was $18. His hands trembled slightly. When a former resident of his, someone who'd watched him teach cardiac procedures in operating theaters with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, made eye contact from the doorway, Sterling looked away first. He always did now. Meanwhile, the VA hospital where Rachel had sat at 3 a.m. surrounded by damage she recognized was being transformed. The waiting room where she'd almost disappeared into her own trauma was becoming a veterans clinic. The walls would soon display her Navy Cross citation, her unit photo from Helmand, and a commitment to the kind of care that comes from someone who understands that scars tell stories. Martinez joined her there, the combat medic who'd watched her perform that impossible needle decompression, and together they implemented the protocols they'd learned in the field, the ones that work when equipment fails and you have to rely on hands and knowledge and absolute certainty. The first month, their trauma mortality rate dropped 18%. The general was standing with a cane when he attended the opening ceremony, his voice still recovering but stronger each week. He looked at Rachel across the room and said to the assembled veterans, "Some heroes never stop serving." That night, Rachel was in fresh scrubs responding to a 3-car collision on Route 97 when a new temp nurse watched her work. The same nurse who would hear Rachel give orders with the precision of someone who'd managed chaos in combat zones. The same nurse who would eventually ask why Rachel's hands moved with such certainty, why her voice commanded obedience without ever raising, why she seemed to understand every patient's damage before they spoke. Rachel didn't explain. She just worked, her combat boots visible beneath the scrubs now, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed of the ground she'd covered in service. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you want stories about the quiet warriors, the ones who carry impossible strength in calm hands, subscribe now. Like this video. And tell us in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?